Today's presenter is Paul Levy. Paul's a senior lecturer in innovation management at the University of Brighton and a researcher in the Centre for Innovation Management. Our research centre, Centrum, within the Brighton Business School, is renowned for closing the loop between research and practice. So Paul's research focuses on how innovation knowledge and entrepreneurial dynamics contribute to theory, policy and practice. I'm fortunate to have had first-hand experience of Paul's support for SMEs through his work on several knowledge transfer partnerships, if that's a scheme that you're familiar with, including a recently completed programme with X-Tech Cloud, a local SME who you may be familiar with and indeed may be a customer of. But Paul's also a vastly experienced writer and facilitator, which I think he'll tell you a little bit more about himself. You might hear my voice again because I'm keeping an eye on the meeting chat, and I will be linking through to questions when they arise. But I'll try and shut up for now and hand over to Paul. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks very much, Shona, and thank you everyone for coming to what I hope is going to be a very challenging, stimulating, informative, inspiring hour. And we're just going to bring up my slide deck here, though, as Shona said, we are not looking for death by PowerPoint here. So what I'm hoping that you're actually going to do is to disrupt this set of slides with questions, and also please comment in the Q&A as well. So if you've got some comments to make, that Q&A panel is going to be really, really helpful, and we'll be feeding those in not just at the end, but as we go along. As Shona said, that I'm a senior lecturer at Brighton Business School. I work part-time at Brighton Business School, and for the last 30 years I've also run my own company, which has been a consultancy. I've done facilitation in the field of what was early on change management, innovation management, and increasingly has come to look at the whole landscape of the digital world and how we can use that effectively and mindfully in particularly small businesses. And so this is a conversation with you really about how we're going through the word, lockdown, but we're also hearing about unlocking at the moment, but how long, what that takes and what form that takes is going to kind of inform what we experience in this webinar as well. A little bit by way of introduction, the person on the left is myself in the only posh suit I ever had as a child. And there's a reason for that, because as I grew up, the main device in our house was the phone at the top there. That wasn't digital, that was analog. There was one downstairs, and apparently we were lucky enough to have one upstairs. They were very expensive to use, and if one person was using it, no one else could, of course. And there were great arguments as we grew up about how much it cost to use the phone. That transferred into the phone you see on the right, the very first digital wireless phones, and then the arguments around the house then with those devices, which runs true to this day, is of course that we couldn't find them, and that batteries had run out and all of that kind of stuff. Down on the bottom left is the first computer I ever had, which was an Acorn Electron, which had 16K of memory, which wouldn't even fill, one small thumbnail image now. That then became the 32K BBC Micro. I was there, I guess, at the start of personal computing, and I became addicted to Space Invaders and various games, and I grew up with this technology. But in those days, which I kind of look as the good old days, I was one of Generation X. The digital world was not affecting us, and particularly not affecting most businesses as it is today. And yet some of the problems that we're facing now as we come out of lockdown can be found when we go right back to those roots in history. Particularly when I became a parent, I got very worried about my own behaviour in relation to the digital world in my own business, and actually how the digital world was not positively only affecting the success of my company, but there were lots of downsides to it. And being an academic, I had the opportunity to do a lot of research over a number of years, and it culminated in this book, Digital Inferno. And this is not an advertisement to buy the book, it's just the book itself is how we work as academics. Is we write academic papers, we root what we have to say in evidence, and a lot of what this webinar is about is rooted in not just our own research but all kinds of stuff. But going back to that picture of me when I was young, this has been the first time in the last few years that longitudinal data has come out. And you're probably hearing now how looking for a vaccine for COVID would have taken years and years, and they're trying to bring it down ideally, hopefully not idealistically, to within a year to help save a lot of lives. We've not really had detailed scientific evidence and data about what the impact of digital technology is actually having definitively on our personal and our working lives. But certainly some of our research and some of the research out there is now starting to inform what's happening in your own businesses, and that's why this webinar might be well timed, as a lot of small businesses are clinging on to dear life and hoping that they're going to survive the next few months as we come out of lockdown, with small shops opening perhaps in the next month or so, and hopefully not having to close again with the second wave of COVID. We don't really know about the future. It's very, very uncertain, but a lot of businesses are hoping to restart. So that's why I think in some ways the attempt of the webinar is a bit of a wake-up call, because things are going to be very, very tight financially, and we're going to have to focus very much down on the essential to be able to emerge from this. Certainly true in my own company as a consultant, where suddenly most of my business was wiped out overnight. And luckily for me, it's only been in the digital space that there's still been interest in my products and services. What we're really looking at is the landscape of devices. Of course, it's not just the computer anymore. It's not even just the smartphone anymore. More and more people are looking at other devices as well. There's the tablets. There are different operating systems, not just Windows and Mac, but the rise of the Chromebook using Android has really grown in the last year. And of course, the smartwatch and the Amazon Alexa and lots of other devices are currently being launched upon us to a greater or lesser extent. So this is a practical look really at how our businesses can emerge from COVID-19 with digital resilience. Can we survive this? Can we go through? And I do believe there's a significant portion of our time and resources that are being used more or less well with our digital kind of landscape in our companies. So this is a webinar, and as Shona said, that doesn't mean a lecture, it's a web seminar. And for us at universities, a web seminar, there's content, conversation, questions, discussion. And please contact me afterwards if you want to continue that conversation, not to buy products and services, but if you want to engage in some of our research or just challenge and continue, please connect with me on LinkedIn and contact us through the university. Now, pre-COVID-19, if you look into our research, and I just invite you to reflect on your own businesses, you certainly don't have to agree with all of these things, but certainly many SMEs, quite a high percentage, were admitting in surveys to having no real digital strategy. They had computers, they had smartphones, they bought software, but it didn't quite fit together in the way that other parts of their business did have a business plan or strategy. Quite often it just sat on the balance sheet as a purchased item. Like many people in general, we really were in responsive mode on digital devices. Little boundary between work and home life, the phone constantly on, the idea that busy is good, and yet a lot of the evidence is that we were wasting a lot of time and money, and it wasn't generating new sales, being constantly connected, and in some cases it was destroying families. Has that continued in lockdown? Has it got worse as we're working from home? Certainly devices were being reported as a lot not digitally secure, and it's like a burglar, it's only really when it happens to you that you realise. They certainly didn't properly sync their data. The iPhone and the Android phone and the laptop and the desktop all seem to have different versions of various emails and documents, and we always seem to be on the wrong one when we were looking for a version of something. Particularly annoying to people was they couldn't find contacts on address books because there would seem to be different versions, and calendars weren't quite syncing. We were losing time and money through digital distraction and inefficiency, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a little while. But perhaps more shocking is some of the evidence that particularly small business people in busy mode, even more so now, and possibly even more so as we come out of this, is the horrible punchline is just as we may have avoided COVID, we get an even worse version of it because we were already potentially compromising our immune systems through poor health and well-being, often centred around digital addiction and misuse of our phones to the services of our business. So just to start with, I'd like to do a devices check-in, and as Shona mentioned, there's a Q&A panel, and this is a chance to practice that as well. But I'd like to ask you a question. It's an anonymous answer in the chat, but I would like to ask you, what is the number of digital devices that you currently own and use? Okay, so add those up. How many do you actually own and use? It needs to be both of those. It can be phones, it can be computers, laptops. Think about maybe over the last year, how many, and could you type those now in the Q&A? My confession is 5 at the moment. Just while we're doing that, Shona, how many have you got? You need to unmute, I think.
fell at the first hurdle there. I've got 3 devices, laptop, iPad, phone, all of which are in front of me right at this second.
Okay. Nothing else at all, just those.
Many more in the home, but not necessarily primarily mine.
Okay. Do you ever use them?
Well, I'm homeschooling at the minute, so I'm always on other people's devices checking various things. But...
I've just pushed you over 6. Yeah. Okay. What's coming in the Q&A? What sort of numbers have we got?
Right. We've got a 4. We've got a 6. So 6 is out and ahead. Another 4. Another 4. A 3. A 4 is a common response here.
Yeah.
There's still more coming in. 4. Oh, so that's interesting. So that's phone, laptop, iPad, and a watch coming in there as a 4th device. Someone's saying, would you include a smart TV?
Oh, for sure. It's digital.
We've got a couple of 5s, another 5. So what's that? Everyone's between 3 and 6 so far.
It may shock people that just some of the early evidence of some of the fastest growing SMEs, and it's particularly are the kind of, the pioneers, the inventors, often refer to the fact that they only have 2. Most people, according to research, own and use at least 3 different digital devices. Many people own and use 5, and some people admit to owning and using over 5. And of course, you might be saying, so what? And, if you do have those working for your business and they're not wasting time and they're not kind of causing health problems and they are secure and syncing and are at the service of what your company is doing, then it is potentially a so what question, because we're all different. And for some of us, 6, 7, 8 might work for us. But certainly the evidence that's coming out of kind of long-term impact on businesses is people have too many, don't use them well, and they're in kind of device overload and even upgrading as we speak, and not throwing the old ones away and still sort of using them. So the problems are that many businesses have no digital devices strategy. They've got no rules or procedures. They're not synced. Information is inconsistent, out of date on different devices. Levels of security vary across device. Employees and owners use devices inefficiently and in ways that impact on customers and other stakeholders. They also have legacy devices that are stored insecurely or even hold business critical information. Information is not synced or properly integrated. And I am quite interested in anecdotal evidence from people that are doing business and life coaching that this state of affairs, and people aren't always aware of it, does affect stress levels and can even affect sleep. We tend to favour our mobile phones at the moment, and these are not always the best device for a chosen task. In one survey, respondents were asked, how did you feel when you misplaced your mobile phone? 73% felt physical panic, 14% felt desperate, 7% felt sick, and hopefully I would be one of the 6% that felt relieved. But we feel of all these devices, still very, very tied towards our mobile phone. Of course, you might feel very tied towards your beautiful, expensive MacBook, but there's still quite a high level that's mobile phone tied. And that's a risk to companies, particularly as we go out of lockdown. Just to mention, I don't want to make everyone paranoid, but there's some other data recently about how little we're washing our phones safely and how much COVID could be all over them. One of my favourite words, wilfing. And I'm just going to start to lay out some of the potential problems that if we are coming out of COVID and we've got some potential space now in hibernation, in lockdown, to actually change some behaviours, this is probably the first one to work on. And in some surveys, people say they don't do this until it's shown to them that they actually do from their browsing history and so on. Wilfing stands for, what was I looking for? And are you a wilfer? Essentially, wilfers simply turn their phones on with an absolutely clear intention of doing something. Could be their laptop, they open up a browser, they were going to search for something. 5 minutes later, they're looking at timeshare accommodation in Bulgaria, or they've been on eBay just seeing, oh, something's really cheap here and there was an offer. And the original task has got lost. And literally, it can be hours per day are spent on seemingly useful activity that simply has taken them away from their thread. They've lost the thread which was running their business. And that has got worse in some cases, to the point where wasting a couple of hours a day when you could have been growing your business, could have been recovering it, actually makes the difference between success and failure. And it can be a real shock to people to realise how much wolfing they're actually doing. We tend to wolf on our mobile devices, I should say far more than on our laptops and desktops. So again, if you've got your phone now, maybe you're even watching this on a Teams app already, and it could be down to my appalling presentation, or it could simply be that you're a wolfer and you've already kind of zoned out of your Teams app and you're already on a browser, you're already checking some emails, and actually you're not really taking in what's being said here that could be of value to you. A second problem that we're going to look at how do we deal with is memory trouble and willpower fade. But just before I do, I just want to invite you to post your questions, challenges, if you've got any, into the Q&A panel here. Memory trouble is just being measured now, and I'll look at it a bit later, around video call tiredness, texting tiredness, which is that we are starting significantly to forget what we've been saying and what we've been hearing and what we've been reading. And it all feels very valuable at the time, but tasks get done, tasks get lost. We accidentally prioritize the most recent thing because we've forgotten what we'd agreed to before. And even when we make lists of things to do, sometimes we even forget to look at the lists. Over time, that can just lead to willpower fade. It's because we sort of get a wash of content the whole time across lots of different devices. And it particularly happens around constant reacting to mobile phones, is that we sort of lose the will to do stuff. And actually, there's been measurements over time, particularly in small business leaders, that they've been measured as far less productive at the end of a year than the beginning of a year, as their mobile phone use particularly has increased. So that's all about some skills that I'm going to cover in a moment. What do you think about that so far? Do you have any comments? Do you have any questions? Is there anything coming in yet, Shona?
Sorry, I've done it again. We don't have any questions right now. Can I just very briefly interrupt, because we've got one person having sound issues, and I'd just like to just check that that's not a widespread problem. So if a few people could just pop in the Q&A that they can hear, that would reassure us while we try and sort out the individual person. Yeah. And at the same time, keep your questions coming.
Yeah, I know that we're going pretty fast on this, so there is time just to breathe for the moment. If there's anything you disagree with or something would like to ask, please do put that in the chat. Willpower fade has been measured very scientifically in terms of people being asked to share diaries. It's a bit like they often do with shopping surveys and so on. People keep a diary every day, and so people are invited to write down, could be digitally or physically, what they think they need to do for the day, and then at the end of the day and the end of the week they actually write down what they've done, and that is compared to the amount of digital use and the content of it, and noticing how much they're wilting, forgetting what they should be doing, and sort of losing the will to do some of the really important stuff because they're just going into a kind of digital tiredness. That's being reported in lockdown, but I guess we're going to come out of lockdown with a lot to do. And it's really important, I'd say, now that we start to get some discipline and control over all these devices that we've got. So digital burnout was certainly being reported last year, and people were throwing their hands up about, particularly, it's been going for years, the overfull inbox. And of course, there are things you can do about that, which are around some of the skills that we need. And screen tiredness around Zoom, people are being asked what they remember from a Zoom call, and they can't remember most of it. So is it really an economy to be on Zoom calls all day if actually the level of quality of action that you as a leader are supposed to be taking, or your colleagues, doesn't actually happen, or happens at quite a low level of quality?
Paul,
go ahead.
There's a bit of a question in here. Yeah. So also an interesting comment by someone who's responding to an email whilst listening to this, which links into the question really is, how do you compare wolfing or multitasking? Are they two sides of the same coin?
So, and I think that's a really good question, and I would kind of throw it back to say, the person that can only really answer this ultimately is yourself. If you are good at juggling, and it's interesting, some people learn the physical skill of juggling and pick it up quicker than other people. If multitasking is there are 3 or 4 things to do and you can do them alongside each other and that works, and you could prove that to yourself through the measurement of the impact of that, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with that juggling. Usually what happens is when it's wolfing rather than multitasking, is the benefits are not so justifiable. So spending lots and lots of time just daydreaming, looking at some shopping things, when what you really should have been doing was finishing the rather boring task of checking a really important tender that was going out, possibly to a new client. You've got to weigh up, haven't you, that if you were doing that alongside a tender that was then late or not as well checked because you hurried it and you lost the tender, well, there's the difference between skilled multitasking and wolfing. And in the research, lots of people were thinking they were multitasking, but were shown that they were wolfing in terms of the measured, well, problems and benefits that arose. Quite often, also, as I said in the research, things you thought you were going to do when you wolf just don't seem to get done. Whereas good multitaskers are able to get it all done in parallel. What a great skill to have. So I know I'm sounding really depressing here, but it's a kind of shakeout in order to go somewhere positive by the end of this webinar. We hold too much information, usually poorly synced across many digital devices. A lot of phones are becoming sluggish, full up of too much information, too much, even laptops start to do that as well. And could it be time during lockdown to have a real shakeout, back up stuff properly, but not just have it slowing down your computers? Not every business needs to have its information synced, but if you do, and if you feel I need the stuff on all the devices to be up to date so I could pick up anyone in a different context, well, then you need to sync your information properly. And there are some really, really good free videos currently knocking around YouTube about how to sync just about every phone, computer, how to do it quite easily. This is the firefighting mode too, and you may notice this on mobile phones particularly. We tend to respond to the thing immediately in front of us. We're writing an email, it's quite important we focus on it. You know, if we're a good multitasker, it's going to be okay, but what happens is suddenly the phone lights up with the text. It could even be a personal one. We leave the narrative hanging in the air on the email. We then answer what could be an extremely irritating message. We then go back to the email, and the last half of that email has got a bit of that irritation washing all over it. And we don't even look because we press send, but it's not us at our best. It can create a sense of stress, often subconscious. We can drop tasks, lack of priority, over quick shorthand responses. When we could have actually replied in detail, we write cool or yes. People are sometimes shocked when they're shown some of their email responses at work, sometimes to customers or suppliers, that were just shorthand because the person had wolfed or actually just kept becoming distracted by things coming in on lots of different devices. That can lead to lots of unnecessary clarification, further communication.
Paul, I've got a sort of combined comment and question that's just come in. So I'll just read it out. So I think many organisations will have a real issue with culture when work resumes or returns to a degree of normality. It takes 66 days to learn a habit, and we're now at 60 plus days. So do we think that companies are planning for the cultural implications of reintegrating employees, teams and colleagues into a workplace or back from furlough?
And I think what I'm saying, and you know, that is a great comment, because if lockdown has made us even more digitally engaged, even more tired, kind of, and different people have done this differently. Some people are in very, very small flats and not really struggling to get home life and work life separated. Other people may be lying on a sofa right now, half listening to this and reading emails. Whatever it is that we've done for whatever reasons, if we head back into tighter recessionary times, trying to keep our businesses going, and we've picked up all kinds of habits or continued them, and we have a kind of digital weight bearing down on us rather than a way of making us more agile and lean, we are going to have problems. Those are the companies that are going to be the ones that don't last very long. We've got to use this as an opportunity to exactly look at that culture. And I'd suggest, and I've already know some companies are already talking about this, that as people come off furlough, if they've been lucky enough to do that, before we open the door, we need to have some away days. We need to reignite some training, and it has to be led from the top. If the business owner is walking the talk of these poor behaviours, it's very unlikely anyone else is going to follow. So I'd agree, it has to be prioritised because we have to have the right culture of recovery. And you can see some of them listed here. Just to mention too, this has come out quite recently about the different devices we've got. For example, if you're on Zoom, you've got less functionality on Zoom than you have if you're using Zoom on a laptop. That's created some Zoom bombing issues because there aren't enough settings. It's also created that some people on the team have got lovely backgrounds of the Bahamas, and other people on their phones have just got their flat that they're in, and you don't realise, but it creates a kind of mixed culture of communication, because that becomes a kind of has and has not little feature that can create defensiveness in some companies where that was already a cultural issue. So I think we need to start thinking about when we use Zoom, because Zoom could be good for informal meetings, but if we're zooming in on our phones, we're actually trying to create meetings that require use of all of Zoom's capabilities. The danger is that we sort of dumb down and lower the quality of our video conferencing. And so it's just worth thinking about when you really need to be sitting at whatever device has the full features of whatever app you're trying to use to get work done. There's really a new critical skill that I discovered when I wrote the book for SME leaders that I actually found when I was looking at some old paintings from hundreds of years ago. And what they showed was that in the days of the old apprenticeships and the trades, that people had such a huge pride in their tools and their practice. And what they practiced actually was placement, putting tools away at the end of the day, choosing the right tool for the job, learning how to use it properly. They certainly didn't take those tools home and sort of use them in bed at night. Tools were part of the pride of the particular trade that you worked in. People sat over their tools with a kind of attention, and you can see a mastery of the tool. Lots and lots of pictures of people kind of slouching back using these tools is that we tend to then go into wolfing mode. We tend to just be in reacting mode. The very physical gesture of leaning over tools is a way of gaining that mastery. And there's some research going on into that now about, apart from all the backache and the repetitive strain syndrome and all of that, that there are physically good ways of using tools. I promise you, you will probably write a different email sitting over your phone, even if you're thumb typing it, than slouching back. There's evidence that we type differently. And these are businesses we're running here. And that's, again, part of the questioner's comment about culture. Placing our digital tools, having places to put them, the right places, not just leaving them by the bed as a surrogate alarm clock affecting our sleep, but actually coming down. There's a charging station if we're working from home in the corner. There's a place we take our tools to work. If our phone is largely social, but our tablet is largely work, we don't confuse them and mix them up. There is a right tool for the job. And certainly there's evidence that reduces stress, improves confidence, improves communication, and can reduce delay, because we're simply in charge of the tools that we're using. So the different kinds of placement that I've been noticing in my research are physical placement, as I've just mentioned, where there is a right place, a healthy place for the digital tool. Time placement is all about not making decisions at 2 in the morning, discovering that our most creative time for us personally is at, say, 6:30. We wake up, we maybe go for a walk, we come in, then we do all our emails, because that's when we've got the energy for writing. Whereas it could be that time for meetings is not good after lunch when we're ready to sleep, and it might be energy comes back at 4 o'clock after a walk, and that's when we do our Zoom calls. But as much as you can, these become skills. Digital world placement is all about deciding what the right platforms are. Should you be spending hours on Facebook as a company when actually the engagement is on LinkedIn? And really learning where within the digital world we place our energy. Psychological and emotional placement, it's really important not to wake up in the morning to, you know, an angry text from somebody that can ruin your day and affect how you work. It might be better to deal with what might feel like an emotional email. You can see it's one at a time when you feel emotionally strongest to do it. And this needs to, is starting to come into education when we teach digital skills to children, that these are skills that are as much relevant to them as they are in the physical world. Out of that comes a skill called, I call it digital discernment. An example of that is when you practice discernment, which is really using placement. A Zoom call, if it's a social call, you might use your smartphone. If it's a creative call, and you might even be using your Apple Pencil or whatever, well, let's do that on the tablet. It could be that you're using two different devices. It could be that you've got the Zoom call where you can see people and you've got your iPad next to you, and it's sitting at a table with your back upright, feeling very, very comfortable and relaxed. With a laptop or PC, the Zoom call is usually better for information and task management. If it's a smartwatch, well, you know, you could be getting a reminder that you need to go for a walk because you've just done a long Zoom call, or it could be that you've got a Zoom call in 10 minutes. And there are ways of discerning which are the right devices to use. Just one more thing around that, which is about discernment, which is between watched, listened to, written and read. And really, there's been research back into the 70s that started to identify when people watch loads of TV, they went into a mode called passive watching, where they forgot a lot of what they watched, they hardly moved, and they weren't engaged with it. And certainly when pictures are delivered to you, you don't exercise your imagination very well. So if you're trying to be visionary and strategic with your staff, actually it can be better to do an audio call or to send them something like radio, because the evidence has been there for a long time that if you listen to an audio book, you have to meet it with your own active imagination. You can be more visionary because the pictures aren't delivered to you in the same way that they are on TV. So if you're getting Zoom tiredness, some people I've been talking to recently have wanted to call me, and they're very specifically about audio conference or phone calls alongside those Zoom calls. Any comments, questions coming in? I've lost you, Shona.
No questions at the minute. I'll keep you posted.
Okay, thanks a lot. A few other just thoughts for you. This one I picked up from parenting, but I think it's very good for your mental well-being going into an even busier digital age. And I call it not this, but that. But quite a lot of digital marketing wants to make us feel that when we switch our phones off, we're somehow denying the digital world. If we say we're cutting down, everything we do is still in terms of going back in there. But actually, if you take your kids camping, as we've done, quite often if they're a bit digitally addicted, as is the case in some of our family and lots of other families, the first day they'll probably go and try and find that one bar in the corner of the field of mobile phone signal. But when they realise it's not there, a day after that, and they're all climbing trees, and it's because they're doing that. They're no longer in a not this state. And so if you are finding yourself as an owner or leader online for hours and hours, you're going to find if you say, well, I'm switching off, I'm sort of giving up, it's still quite a negative state to be. Whereas if actually you start to assert, what does your business really need to do now to survive over the next year, and put your energy and your time into doing those things, some of those won't necessarily be involving digital at all. As soon as we say mobile phones off too often, it's like we're being naughty. Whereas if you can just create some cultural norms that Friday afternoon, perhaps socially distancing, but we all meet up for a team meeting, and it's just kind of known, it's not that the phones are off, it's just that they're irrelevant to the fact we're just talking to each other. And you might have flip charts or note paper, but you have to render digital irrelevant when it has no business to be there. And kind of being in a state of we're not doing it, a state of betraying the digital world that should always be on, is a kind of low energy state. It's a different kind of approach. Zoom tiredness, as I mentioned, is being researched a lot. What is currently emerging is we're having too many Zoom calls, and lots of people are reporting actually more productivity if they choose their Zoom calls very, very mindfully and use discernment, rather than the idea that a Zoom call is always a good thing. And I'm saying Zoom, it can be any platform. Ink or Pixel was a paper that I wrote last year where I actually did some research on myself, and it was very, very scary. And essentially what it involved was something called the Ego Index, and I invite you to try this after the webinar. All you simply do is take a sample of your digital writing, perhaps 500 words, and if you've done some recently, or maybe just write something, your physical writing, and divide it by the number of times you've used I or me, and that ratio is your ego index. If every 100 words to one, you don't say I or me at all, or maybe just say it once, that is being almost sociopathic without any kind of social connection. 5 to 1 is an egomaniac, excuse the sort of general use of these words, slightly cartoony. 30 to 1, I'd suggest, is kind of healthy. Every 30 words you write has got a little bit of you in it. And that is a mix, therefore, of you being distanced and you being involved. Now, of course, if you're writing science writing, or there's a particular way that you're writing, it may be 100 to 1 is fine, because you're trying to be very detached and objective. What was scary for me was that the sample of my physical writing was coming out at 30 to 1 and my digital writing was coming out at 100 to 1. And the problem with that is, if we're doing that to each other all the time, we're not really putting ourselves into the digital relationship. And that's when it can start feeling cold and detached, and the meetings can start to feel a bit unconnected, and that doesn't lead to engagement and the involvement we might need from our staff to really get creative and committed to help us get out of this COVID mess. Does anyone identify that in themselves? Still inviting you to put some questions in the chat.
So we've got a couple of questions and comments coming through now. So first of all, we've got a comment that the participants found that giving people good quality devices has increased productivity, and that cheaping out on tech has an impact, and they reflect on this being a positive thing that they managed to do before lockdown. I don't know if you've got any comment about the quality of devices that employees are provided with.
Certainly, there's evidence from attitude surveys that when people feel more valued generally and invested in, they tend to commit more and have lower levels of anxiety. So there's probably an element of just that investing in people. But there is certainly evidence that if a phone, for example, or a digital device, is easier to look at on the eyes, is easier to hold, it has better ergonomics, feels like by its design it's encouraging more engagement and creativity, then you're going to get it. So I would totally agree with that, and there is certainly evidence around that. So yeah, on the cheap, we'll tend to get cheap commitment.
And another comment, going back to the Zoom part of the discussion, was an observation that people's posture and eye line on Zoom and other types of video calls means that it doesn't look, you're not really having eye contact, and it can feel more remote if the person that you're talking to is looking away from you. I'm very conscious, I hate seeing myself in the corner of the screen, because it always looks like I'm looking at someone else. It's very difficult to look at your camera. So is there anything interesting to respond on that one?
Interesting. We're not that far off computers being much more available with a camera that uses AI, so that you get a real experience of much closer to real eye contact, or certainly cameras located in the center of the screen, which is a bit closer. What I noticed, Shona, is you're not sitting face right up against the screen. What you did was a little bit of body language. And the subliminal relationship we have when we're just ahead is that's the brain. It's not the full body and the heart and the blood and guts and the will and all of that. So you tend to then get intellectual, colder conversation from some people when all you see is the head. So even just with your laptop, that's why it's a danger to be using mobile phones. I've got the one here, where if you're using it in a particular way that you're just moving around a lot, making people feel seasick, or that it's just your head, so that kind of subliminally says the intellect, all of this impacts on the quality of the conversation. So ideally, sitting in a place where you have what you might call telepresence, which can be done just with a bit of creativity, where people are sitting kind of close to as if they were sitting in a room. And certainly if we're in a room, we'd be able to see our bodies. Some teachers, and there's some great stuff on YouTube that are teaching practical classes online to children, and certainly some of our lecturers walk around the room and they've got Bluetooth headphones, and you get much more of an embodied experience of them.
And then just a final one, still on the sort of zooming out topic, is if you are trying to cut down from sort of getting to peak Zoom at the beginning of lockdown and maybe wavering a little bit now, is there any advice on whether you should have a day with no Zoom calls, or a time of day with no Zoom calls? How can we best get to a balance that works?
Lots and lots of companies already were having one day off digital for most people, and that was working for a lot of creative companies, is to say, let's just go into the room and have physical meetings at least a half a day. If it suits you to have a whole day off, you'll certainly rest from it. Long rests between Zoom, but the one I want to sell you, because I'm using it, is audio. Does it need us to all be staring at each other? Would it be good, particularly if we're being visionary, to at least turn the Zoom off for a bit and actually just settle down to hearing each other's voices? I'm not sure that's a step back. The rise of radio and podcasts suggest that there is something really stimulating about audio. So there's an experiment to try. I'm certainly using it more. A few other suggestions. One is you can do this on Zoom. Most platforms, not all, is there was evidence this year from quite a lot of anecdotal evidence and people self-reporting that when self-view is on, when you can see yourself, people start preening, becoming a bit narcissistic and performing. And it is possible in Zoom, it's just one tiny setting, to turn off self-view. You can't see yourself anymore. It feels a bit weird, but quite a lot of people go into a much more relaxed state when they're not staring at themselves because it feels a bit like theatre. A few other just thoughts as we go on. Just be aware of the fingertip and thumb problem. Please don't Google digital and thumb arthritis. You'll see lots of pictures of children as well as our age. We're storing up all kinds of stuff that will be measured sooner than later as days off and sickness days in your businesses. So we need to be just aware of what this is doing to our bodies if we don't use these devices well, and sometimes just need to be upright supporting our backs. But other things happen when we tap on glass all the time. That essentially, when you tap really fast, a bit like a spider, you get a very quick connection with your head. It can be very cold and intellectual. Just read the evening newspapers and the chat online below them. People that don't even know each other go into what I call chat rage. There's a coldness that can come from just fingertipping all the time. You can get a hurry, you can then worry you've offended somebody, you can get what I call message explosion and message replication. It all reminds me of my dear dad when computers came in, that whenever he sent me a message, he would always phone me to say he got the message. We've got lots of evidence that if you agree things in chat programs, in things like Slack, unless the culture's really established, people then just message replicate. They'll email you that they messaged you. They'll phone you to confirm as the boss that that's actually what the decision was. And the cost of that is huge. So be very careful about leading from the top on significant stuff by texting people. Sometimes it needs a call, sometimes it needs a face-to-face. These are habits that it might be worth breaking while we're in lockdown and when we emerge. Similar, as I just mentioned, the evidence around listening could be more effective than watching, and is a way of reducing Zoom tiredness. This is just the live transcribe experiment. I'm just suggesting there are other versions of this, but this is on a Android phone. And live transcribe is just one app. It's a Google Android app in partnership with the university, but if you download it, say there are others. This one, of course, makes Google's whole search database available to itself. So it's the first one I've used this year during lockdown to write whole book chapters just by dictating. Because it can search Google, it can find names, it has a good go at grammar, very, very high levels of accuracy that are only going to get better. But that is the possibility now, that you don't need to type. You could, some people may be, I'd love to know in the chat if anyone's doing this, you can start to significantly use your voice. What I discover is if I dictate an email and hear my voice, then I nearly always edit it more. I'm nearly always more conscious and aware of what I'm typing.
Paul, I think people have really warmed up, so I've got a bunch of questions here. Now, they refer back to previous parts of the presentation. Do you want to put those as they're here, or do you want to store them up?
What I'll do is we'll pull them into the last few minutes, because I'm going to just move on to the end, and then we'll pick them all up. Just to mention a few other thoughts. Smart organizing. What devices should we use? Well, there are certainly some really great entrepreneurs that say they're now using smartwatches to very specifically help them manage their time, and they're well worth looking at as a possibility. The rise of the digital pencil, these have got so good. My son got one for Christmas, and this is another way of writing. There are programs that can text recognize your handwriting, and you can start getting that ego index more healthy. And it can give you that ability to think more strategically, because you're not just typing, you're getting that whole wider view, getting out there in nature, but actually without leaving your desk. So what next? Let me just finish with some really practical thoughts. Let's go somewhere positive before we just end on some questions and comments. Well, here we are. This is the world of all of our wonderful devices, the great miracles that are both a boon and a bane, both a benefit, but they also have been dragging our businesses down when we don't use them properly. All kinds of different things are now available to suit us, all different kinds. So here are the next practical steps that I'd like to leave you with that have come out of some of our research and that is to be found out there. Though I would say be careful, because we're all different, and a lot of this research isn't like a medical trial. A lot of it is quite small sample. Digital mythos, ethos and logos. My one bit of hopefully just only academic jargon. Mythos is our vision for digital in our company. Where do we want to be with it? Are we online? Do we still want face-to-face? Ethos are the rules. You know, the habits about what we can do on our phones. Have you been clear? Have we bought into the behaviours that are going to help our business? This could be time to exercise the ghosts of the past. And logos are the measures. How are we going to measure that this is working? Health and well-being, avoiding digital burnout, sitting upright, armrests, breaks, water and natural light, screen filters, lower light, protecting our sleep. These are different for different devices. We know that blue light is not good for us in bed. Make your website smartphone and tablet friendly. This is the time now to realize that we're all using different devices. So as we're doing remote working, lifestyling and stuff, it increases more purchasing decisions, search activities taking place, we know, on mobile devices. Is it time to look at your website? Also, your internal intranet website might need to be more friendly. If you've got any kind of internal systems, are they helpful for people to use on the different devices that they're using? Ensure that your gadgets sync properly, because inconsistency of data, information, that's risky. Business critical information can be out of date sitting on the wrong device. Lots of people have admitted to that, even when they're quite thinking that they're highly synced. Customers, employees do not respond well to inconsistency. Reduce message replication, because that is costly. It's better to do big decisions physically or face-to-face, but also to not forget that we've been emailing for a long time, and so having formal systems are there. We can't just assume that a text message made a decision. Start to practice placement, because a chaotic home is a stressful one. We know that. Boundaries at home between family and work, they're destroying relationships in some cases. It's a more efficient way to work, and it's more secure. It reduces risks. Make your content and processes properly accessible. The more we respond to diversity, the greater our market potential becomes. We've got to make sure going forward that our devices also help people with all kinds of different needs in life, because accessibility is also becoming a award-winning criterion. And as we head out of COVID, I think that's going to become more important. Use your different devices for proper purposes, as I've already mentioned. Make your website smartphone and tablet friendly, I've said, but also make your internal intranet friendly for other reasons, because 5G is coming. Mobile devices are going to become the norm, and certainly they have been practicing that in COVID-19. But also we've got data now that people are going back to laptops and desktops again. There's a kind of pullback from mobiles for everything. To summarize, to finish, smartphones are not good for information intensive business critical decision making. If you're on them too much, be prepared to move onto a different one. Voice has still got more emotional weight and subconscious trust than video. So it's just worth knowing you'll get message replication from decisions on Zoom that people fear are probably being listened to by various governments. Certainly chat has got the least power in terms of people taking that away for a real committed task. Face-to-face with social distancing is going to come back, and it's going to be essential for high-risk business critical decisions. Where possible, if it has to be online, locate your laptop, not just the head but the body. Try and set the laptop up as if you're sitting with a person in the room. And as I've mentioned, emailing is also leading to message replication. People respond to the last thing on emails, not all things. If you ask them to do three things on an email, you'll usually get a reply to just one. We still need to make lists. We still need to confirm things. So thank you for being part of that. I've deliberately raced through this. I'd love to chat to you further if you want to follow up from this, not to sell you anything, but because this is ongoing research that we're involved in. Hopefully we've got 5 minutes or so for some more reaction and questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Paul. Yes, we have got a little cluster of questions to go through. I'm just going to take them in order, I think, at this stage. So the biggest issue with all this digital is that we miss out on the physical energy that we convey when communicating. Any further tips on how we can address this?
So I think, as I've mentioned, if we're forced into lockdown, less, I believe, is more. Blending, we often talk about this in universities, blended learning, which is to make sure that you physically place the devices so it's not just your head, and that you, if possible, actually move around the room and show what you're doing. I'm sitting back from my screen a little bit, but there is some simple stuff that you can do, but also knowing that this has got worse for us. Most people are not really celebrating all the Zoom conversations that they're actually having. So, for example, in the university, we're using audio more, and certainly in my own work, I'm recording texts with my voice rather than just sending them. And there's evidence more and more people have finally discovered there's a microphone button instead of constantly having to type stuff, and people are sending voice messages. If I had one view in the preparation, is to use this as physically as possible and not as statically as the technologies seem to encourage us to do.
I'm having a little chuckle at that because it doesn't really get my Scottish accent. I get some very strange translations. Right, the next question goes back to the ego index and is querying whether the ego index is taken from any digital writing, i.e. from any subject, any email that you're covering.
So when I wrote the article, I took various samples of my writing, and what shocked me was that, having run a lot of workshops and been a facilitator, on a train home, which I haven't done for a long while, I would either use a notebook sometimes or just tap into my phone. So I took those samples. These are supposed to be my reflections on how I can improve, what went well with the client. And it was a real shock to discover that on the phone, I was just much more cold and detached. In some ways it was a bit more objective, but there wasn't enough of me in there to use my emotional intelligence than in the notebooks. The reaction for me was that I actually went back to the notebooks. I almost fled back. But as I say, if you want high degrees of separation, like some scientific detachment, it might be a good thing to have 100 to 1. Depends on what the task is. But if in the end, as it seems to be shown, that fast fingertip writing makes us a bit too emotionally detached, as managers of people, that could be a huge risk.
Okay, lovely. So we've got 2 more questions, which I think will pretty much bring us up to time. But if you have further questions, put them in the chat, or we'll give you contact details at the end. We're very happy to keep the dialogue going. So the next one is a question about technology in the bedroom. How do we manage employees who don't have the luxury of privacy or space to have effective work patterns that allows them a choice in where they're situating themselves?
Well, the first thing to say is, if there's any science that has really got a lot of data, it is, and not everyone this affects. Some people, you know, like famous writers as well, have loved being up at 2 o'clock in the morning, but mostly we make poor decisions and it affects our health if we're sitting with laptops till 2 o'clock in the morning when we're tired. And so what people have done, and they've been reporting this, is if it has to be the bedroom, they still practice placement. There is a time at which they need to turn these things off and go and plug them in somewhere else and not use them. And to turn, you know, notifications off. Working with some companies, they've developed, I would say, toxic cultures where they think they're supposed to be on 24/7 when they're not. It just needs better scheduling, and you know, what it sometimes needs as well is to really sit down with customers and create realistic expectations. Certainly AI in the future might be able to automate that stuff, but what is the point in offering short-term customer service if those people are off sick, stressed, and end up catching COVID because they've got compromised immune systems? So ultimately, if it's in the bedroom, we can still protect the ritual of sleep being a restorative thing, and having half an hour before sleep to go for a walk, look out the window, and so on. Other really basic things around, just make sure the screen's not so bright, if you can, and manage the content. So the least threatening content is what you take to sleep. Don't have all the angry stuff as the last thing you do. Get rid of that in the morning.
Okay, so I think we'll probably leave it there because there's another question, but it's slightly off topic, and I think I can deal with that in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
So that just leaves me, I think. So thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much for everyone who's interacted and given us your comments and questions, which did turn it into a dialogue. So just in terms of tying up, Emmy, are you able to flip on to the next slide?
Shona, can I just mention, I forgot that if people would like to connect up with me, Paul Levy, on LinkedIn, I'm really open to conversation about these things. It's part of what we're very passionately researching at the moment. It's a field I've worked in for a long time. So do just connect up, give me some more feedback, challenge, ask questions, and we can continue the conversation in other ways afterwards.
Thanks, Paul. Paul, do you need to stop sharing so Emmy can put the end slide up with the contact details? Thank you. So yes, I'm well aware we're now at 13:01, which means we should be closing up. But just a couple of things to end up with. So hopefully a slide will be coming up shortly, which gives the University of Brighton website address where you can find out.
That's up there now, Shona.
It's not the version that I was expecting, but okay. That's fine. We can circulate the other one. That's fine. So yeah, that's the one I'm looking for. Yes, lovely. So we've got the website address there where you can find a little bit more about how we can support businesses. We've also got up there the web addresses for our business network partners, Coast to Capital and Business East Sussex, and we're very grateful to both those organisations for helping us to promote the webinar series and getting you all engaged today. And just to close up, just a reminder that this is the first of 4 webinars. So we've got 3 more in the series, the next one being on Friday at the same time. And that's Professor George Sakura's talking about crisis innovation. So a different topic, but I would imagine relevant to a subset of the people here at least. And then a final reminder that a recorded version will come up on YouTube once we've had a chance to do a little bit of editing. And right at the very beginning, we had a question about sharing the slides. And yes, we'll be happy to share a version of the slides with all participants. So we'll look at getting those out to you in the next few days. So I think that just leaves me to thank once again Paul for his presentation, the business network partners, and you all for participating, and really to encourage you to stay in dialogue with you. Many thanks. I think we're ready to end. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.